Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Abraham thought so. When God told Abraham that he would have a son when he was 100 years old, the scripture says that Abraham fell down on his face and laughed out loud. God said to him, "You're going to have a son with your wife Sarah," and he thought it was impossible. He laughed out loud at the ridiculous pronouncement from God. It's too fantastical, too ridiculous. He's 100. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Sarah thought so too. Sarah, who was 90 years old, had heard the pronouncement of the visitors that came to Abraham. Abraham had seen these visitors, knew they were a divine presence, and knew they were representatives of God, invited them in, made a banquet, a feast, washed their feet. The hospitality was overflowing. And so as they sat in the tent together, talking to each other, they reminded Abraham of the promise that he was going to have a child, even though he was 100. About a year from now, they say to Abraham, "You will have a son." Sarah is standing outside the tent, probably eavesdropping, listening in, hearing what was being said. And she hears those words that Abraham and Sarah are going to have a child. And Sarah busts out laughing. "I'm worn out," she says. You know how that is. Worn out. I'm not going to have a child now. She is 90 years old. Abraham is old, she says. I'm old. This is silly. And she busts out laughing. And the visitors hear her, the people who are divine visitors of God, and they come and confront her, and they say, "Why did you laugh? Is anything too wonderful for God? When we come back next year, you'll have a child." Sarah was a bit afraid, caught off guard, so she does what anybody does. She denied laughing. "I didn't laugh," she said. "No, I didn't." And the visitors say, "Yes, you did." I can imagine it's one time in the scripture, but I imagine it going on for a bit. You know how it is? "I didn't laugh." "Yes, you did." "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did." "No, I didn't." Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? When I was in high school, I was a part of the United Methodist Church in Star, North Carolina, big town. And I loved church. It was a great place. I became really involved in the youth group. I would go to district meetings and things like that. And as a high schooler, I was on the staff parish relations committee telling the preacher what to do. One day, the minister of my church came up to me and said, "Robert, you're going to make a fine United Methodist minister one day." I laughed out loud. I said, "No, I don't think so. Methodist ministers are old and boring. I'm not doing that. I'm not good at that at all. I would not want to do that." Laughed out loud. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? When I was doing my doctoral work in Toronto, and I went to the North Carolina Annual Conference, which is where I'm from, and it was on that side of the state where I'm from. And I ran into one of my youth that I had known for a very long time. I've known him since middle school, and he was in college at the time. And he said to me, "Robert, you know, we're looking for a chaplain at Greensboro College. You should apply for this job. We've been looking. We didn't fill the position. We've been looking. We need somebody. You should come do that." And I said, "I don't think so. College students? Who wants to work with college students? I do not want to work with college students," I said. "I would not be good at that. I don't think I would like it. That is not for me." I laughed out loud. That was 17 years ago. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? I mean, I can understand why Abraham is laughing at God. I understand why Sarah laughs when God tells her that she's going to bring new life into this world. I can understand how easy it is to dismiss something that seems hard to believe, like you don't think is possible, like you think is ridiculous, like that's not for me, that's not what I'm called to do, that is just too wonderful. Sometimes it seems like things are just too fantastical and wonderful to come true, to be a calling. No, thank you. Maybe it's because I've, grown older in my old age and grown up believing that, sometimes things are just the way they are, And I want things to change, and I hope for things to change, but nothing really changes. People are still the same. I get cynical. And maybe I've come to be resolved to believe that life is just what you get, And sometimes it's full of disappointment. Is anything too wonderful? For the Lord, it sometimes feels like it. Sometimes it feels like it's too wonderful. God's promise, kingdom, love, mercy, justice seems too wonderful and beyond our ability for it to come true. We're old, tired, worn out. Wars still rage. Tensions still rise. Gunshots still ring out. Gun violence becomes the number one cause of death of children in our country. Hatred is spewed against each other. And Christians who are supposed to be the people of love and care and love God and one another are often bent on more hatefulness than anything else, than compassion and love. Worried more about who's in and who's out than anything else. Is anything too wonderful? Just this past week, the Southern Baptists kicked out a few churches because they had the audacity to let women teach and preach and speak. It is no wonder that young people have nothing to do with the church. It's no wonder. On Friday, I was at the North Carolina Annual Conference in Greenville, North Carolina, and Adam Hamilton was there as our speaker. You might know him of his books and reading of his studies and things like that. And he spoke at our conference, and he was very optimistic about the future of the United Methodist Church. And I couldn't help but holding my breath in as I was like trying not to laugh out loud. It's like, really? You're hopeful? Okay. And he showed us the statistics about all the churches are disaffiliating and about those who remained. And he showed about 80% of churches and congregations and membership is pledging to stay in the United Methodist Church and be United Methodist. He said it's a small but loud group of people who are trying to leave. And sometimes they're louder. He was so hopeful for the church and for the future. I really want to believe him. I want to believe him. Yes, I want to believe that, but I have to admit, I kind of laughed a little bit under my breath. Like, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? It's like, seems to be. It feels like it. I mean, I think that's why Abraham laughed. That's why Sarah laughed. That's why I laughed. That's maybe why you laugh. Because it feels so beyond reality. Because all the evidence seems to say, this is impossible. It's too wonderful. About a year after Sarah laughed out loud at those visitors, she had a child. She was 91. God told Abraham and Sarah that this child, this impossibility, this impossible new life, this impossible thing that happened, God says, you're going to name this child Isaac. You know what Isaac means? Laughter. Oh, God has a great sense of humor. Naming the child Laughter. Because you know that every time Abraham and Sarah called that child, they would be reminded that they laughed out loud at God's promise for them. Every time they called that child's name, they would be reminded that they laughed at God's possibility. Every time, they called that name a lot. Isaac, get in here. Isaac, clean your room. Isaac, help your father. Isaac, stop doing that, right? Every single time they called that name, they would be reminded again that what God brought they thought was impossible. That they were reminded that they laughed out loud that what they thought was too wonderful for them and for God was not too wonderful at all. And maybe that is the point, to be reminded over and over and over again that nothing is impossible with God, even when it seems otherwise to be true, even when all evidence points to not being true, that nothing is impossible with God. And maybe the point is to have a faith that believes in impossibilities, to have a faith that believes and delights in God's possibilities, to believe that God's mercy and justice and promise of new life is possible. It's possible. And to have faith enough to believe that the sorrow, the death, the violence, the hate of this world does not have the final say, even though it's so loud and sometimes feels so strong. Maybe we're called to believe in the impossibility of our faith and believe that with God, all things are possible. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Yesterday, in the North Carolina Annual Conference, where I was yesterday, we ordained 8 new ministers to be part of the clergy in North Carolina. We ordained 8 new people to be clergy. One of those candidates was recently married to someone of the same sex. And after a great deal of debate, the Board of Ordained Ministry and the clergy of the conference voted overwhelmingly to support this candidate. And yesterday, the bishop laid her hands on this candidate and ordained them into ministry, and all of those candidates into ministry. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? In Amarillo, Texas, all of the United Methodist churches in the city disaffiliated. They all became something else. All of them. There were 4 or 5 in the city. There's 200,000 people in that city. One of the retired clergy who lived there, Reverend Margie McNear, she said, this can't happen. There are people who need a church home. So she started a new congregation in Amarillo, Texas. Marjorie McNear, the minister, is 82 years old. She said, God has a sense of humor about retirement. And now she has a congregation of 80 to 100 people worshiping on Sunday mornings at a borrowed space in a Presbyterian church in Amarillo, Texas. She's 82 years old, starting new ministries and new congregations and new life in that city for people who are United Methodist. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Next week, we'll be worshiping with St. Timothy's United Methodist Church. There will be some of us here for people who want to come and be a part of our church here, but most of us will go there so that we can worship with them, see how they worship, get to know them better, learn how to love one another. In a time when churches are falling apart, arguing and disaffiliating, want to have nothing to do with each other, we are joining a vital congregation, and they are joining us to do ministries in ways we have not even imagined yet. Maybe God is calling us to see what is impossible and to believe that it is possible. To create new ministries in this church and community and congregation in ways we have not even imagined or believed to be possible. Maybe God's calling you to do something new in your life and ministry and work. Maybe God's calling you to do something with the children in this church. Or maybe God's calling you to mentor college students who will come here in the fall. Or maybe God's calling you to start new Sunday school classes, or to advocate for people who might walk into this church, into this building, or might go out into the community, to be on Tate Street, to love those people right outside our doors. I know it might sound silly for me to say this is what you're being called to do. I don't know what God's calling you to do, but I can imagine that if God's calling you and you're laughing, is probably a possibility upon your life. I know. I laughed at every time God called me to do something because I didn't think it was possible. Because of my age or job or ability or whatever it was I gave an excuse for. Is anything too wonderful for God? Abraham and Sarah found out that new life was possible even at their age. I found out that God calls an awkward kid to lead a congregation and work with college students. The United Methodist Church is finding out that our gay and lesbian siblings are faithful people. Maybe we'll find out that we're called to ministry we haven't even imagined, ministry we think might be impossible. I don't know, maybe we'll find out that nothing is too wonderful for the Lord.